On a black volcanic beach in the Pacific, a young man crawled toward a wounded Marine with a white armband on his sleeve. In the center of that armband was a red cross. For almost 100 years, that symbol had carried a single message across the battlefields of the world. Do not shoot this man. He is here to save lives, not take them. On this beach, that promise meant nothing. The red cross on his arm was not protecting him, it was marking him. Somewhere in the ruins ahead, a rifleman had already noticed it and was waiting for him to move again. The men who did this work were called corpsmen, Navy hospital corpsmen assigned to fight and bleed alongside the United States Marines. The Marines called them doc. And by the middle of the war, many of these docs had learned a lesson that no training manual had prepared them for. In the Pacific, the very symbol built to keep them alive had become one of the most dangerous things they could wear. This was not a rumor whispered between frightened recruits. It was a pattern, written into the memories of men who came home and into the records of the units that survived. The decision to remove the cross did not come from cowardice. It came from something colder. It came from watching what happened to the men who kept it on. To understand why American medics stopped trusting the one symbol that was supposed to protect them, we have to go back to what that symbol was built to do. The first islands where it failed, and the brutal logic on the other side of the battlefield that turned a shield into a target. Decades before that beach, the Red Cross was one of the quiet achievements of modern warfare. It came out of the killing fields of 19th century Europe, where wounded men were left to die in the open because no one was allowed to reach them. A Swiss businessman named Henri Dunant watched thousands of soldiers bleed to death after a single battle, and he asked a simple question. What if the men who carried the wounded away were treated as neutral? Not soldiers, not targets, just rescuers. Out of that idea came the Geneva Accords, and the symbol that went with them, a red cross on a field of white. Medical personnel who wore it agreed not to fight. In exchange, the enemy agreed not to shoot them. Ambulances, field hospitals, stretcher bearers, all of it fell under the same understanding. Both sides accepted the rule because both sides needed it. Every army has wounded, every army wants its own medics to live. So across the trenches and forests of Europe, the emblem mostly held. A medic with a cross on his arm could often move where a rifleman could not. At least, that was how it was supposed to work. The corpsmen who carried that cross into the Pacific were not soldiers by trade. They were sailors. The United States Marine Corps did not train its own medics, so the Navy supplied them. A corpsman learned to stop bleeding, to splint bones, to carry a man twice his weight across open ground, and to do all of it while everyone around him was trying to kill everyone else. He was trained to heal inside a machine built to destroy. And when he shipped out, he wore the Red Cross with something close to pride. It told the world what he was. It was supposed to be his protection. The first cracks in that protection appeared on a green, rotting island called Guadalcanal in 1942. It was the first major American land offensive of the Pacific War, and it was where a generation of Marines and corpsmen learned what kind of enemy they were facing. The fighting was close, jungle close. Men fought at ranges of a few yards, in the dark, in the rain, in ground that swallowed the dead. And it was there that corpsmen began to notice something that did not make sense to them. When a Marine went down and a corpsman moved to reach him, the fire did not stop. It shifted. It followed the man with the armband. The cross that was meant to say, "Do not shoot," seemed instead to say, "Shoot here." At first, some told themselves it was chaos. In a jungle firefight, no one can aim carefully and a bullet does not read symbols. But the pattern kept repeating. A corpsman would crawl forward, the white of his armband catching the light, and that was the moment the shooting sharpened. Veterans began to speak about it in low voices. The cross was not a shield out here, it was bait. This was where the story took a turn that few back home would have believed. Because the answer was not that the enemy could not see the cross. The answer was that they could see it perfectly, and that was exactly why they fired. Word of this did not travel through official channels. It traveled the way hard lessons always travel among fighting men, from the survivors to the replacements. On the transports heading to the next island, older corpsmen told the new ones a simple, ugly piece of advice. Take the cross off. Paint over the one on your helmet. Do not carry anything that makes you stand out from the riflemen around you. The armband that the Navy had issued as protection was quietly rolled up and stuffed into a pack or thrown away. By the landings that followed, the practice had spread across units that had never spoken to each other. On the coral hell of Tarawa in 1943, corpsmen went ashore looking as much like ordinary Marines as they could manage. Same dull uniform, same helmet, often the same rifle slung over the shoulder. The idea of a clearly marked, unarmed medic moving safely between the lines had been abandoned by the men who were supposed to be that medic. They had done the math themselves, on the beaches, with their own friends dying in front of them. Some time later, the same reports surfaced from other fronts in the theatre. Different islands, different divisions, the same conclusion. The men who kept the cross visible did not last. The men who hid it had a better chance. When a lesson arrives independently from that many directions, it stops being a rumor. It becomes procedure. You would think someone would have raised the alarm loudly, all the way up the chain. In practice, the change happened from the bottom up, in the field, faster than any manual could be rewritten. The corpsmen were not waiting for permission. They were trying to see their sons and mothers again. And this decision, small as it looked, was a warning sign about the war as a whole. If the men trusted to heal could no longer trust the emblem that protected them, then the oldest agreement on the battlefield had already broken. It just had not been announced. To understand why, we have to step back from the beaches and look at the enemy the corpsmen were facing and the reasoning that made a medic the most valuable man to kill. Here is the cold logic that sat underneath all of it. On any battlefield, a corpsman is not one man. He is many. Every wounded soldier he reaches and stabilizes is a soldier who might return to the fight, or who might at least survive. Remove the corpsman, and every one of those wounded men is left to bleed. A single well-aimed shot at the medic does not take one enemy off the field. It takes the medic, and it quietly takes everyone the medic would have saved. In pure, brutal military terms, killing the healer was one of the most efficient things a rifleman could do. Most armies understood that logic and still chose to honor the cross because they wanted their own medics protected in return. That mutual bargain was the entire point. But in the Pacific, that bargain had come apart. Japan had signed the Geneva Accords of the era, yet its forces in the field rarely honored the protections those accords promised. The emblem that carried weight in Europe carried almost none on these islands. The reasons ran deeper than a single order. The Japanese military of that period was built around a code that treated surrender as disgrace and death in battle as duty. A doctrine that does not recognize surrender for itself is unlikely to recognize the softer rules that surround it, including the neutrality of a marked medic. To a soldier taught that the enemy was to be destroyed without hesitation, a man crawling forward under a red cross was not a neutral figure to be spared. He was a functioning part of the enemy war machine, clearly labeled and briefly exposed. There was another layer, harder to prove and impossible to ignore. Reports and later accounts described medics being targeted deliberately, and prisoners of all kinds treated in ways the conventions were written to forbid. Some historians argue that this reflected official attitudes toward the rules of war. Others describe it as the product of isolated savage island fighting, where discipline frayed and revenge took over. The exact balance is still debated. What is not debated is the result. The corpsman who kept his cross visible was, in effect, wearing a target that his enemy had every reason to shoot. And once the American side understood that, a second grim adjustment followed. If the cross would not protect the corpsman, then the corpsman needed another way to survive. So the man forbidden by his own emblem to carry a weapon began to carry one anyway. Corpsmen picked up rifles and sidearms, not to lead attacks, but to stay alive long enough to do their real work. In doing so, they crossed a line that the Geneva Accords had drawn precisely to keep medics safe. A medic who fights is no longer a protected non-combatant, but that protection had already evaporated. They were trading a paper shield they no longer trusted for a real one they could hold in their hands. If you value history told from the records and the accounts of the men who were actually there, take a moment to subscribe. Untold War Archives covers the parts of these wars that rarely reach the textbooks, the orders, the fear, and the cost. Now, back to the islands, and to what this decision did to the men who made it. By 1945, on the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, The transformation was complete. The corpsman was no longer a clearly marked figure moving under an agreed truce. He was a rifleman who also carried morphine and bandages, indistinguishable from the men around him until the cry went up. That cry, corpsman, or simply Doc, was the sound that sent him running toward the exact spot where a man had just been hit, which was the exact spot the enemy was still watching. The cost of this work is hard to state in clean numbers, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Precise, reliable casualty figures for corpsmen specifically are difficult to separate from the larger record. But veterans and historians agree on the shape of it. Corpsmen died at a rate far out of proportion to their numbers. On the worst islands, a corpsman going ashore could not count on lasting the day. Some units went through their medical men again and again, each replacement inheriting the same impossible job, the same short odds. And still they went. That is the part that lifts this story above its own darkness. Marines who survived those battles spent the rest of their lives talking about their doc, with a kind of reverence usually reserved for family. The corpsman was often younger than the men he saved. He was not a Marine by branch, a sailor dropped into a ground war, and yet the Marines around him would do almost anything to keep him alive, because they knew that if they were hit, he was the only chance they had. Protecting the dock became its own unwritten rule, one the men actually kept. The record of what these men did under fire is staggering. Navy corpsmen received a remarkable share of the highest awards for valor given in the Pacific, many of them for pulling wounded Marines out of fire that should have killed the rescuer first. A large number of those awards were given after the corpsman's death. They earned them by doing the one thing their training demanded and their situation forbade: moving toward the wounded in the open, while everyone with a rifle watched for movement. Behind every one of those citations was a smaller, unrecorded moment. A corpsman deciding whether to reach a screaming man now, or wait for a lull that might never come. A corpsman working on a wound by touch in the dark because a light would draw fire. A corpsman who had long since thrown away his armband, kneeling over a friend, knowing that the sound of his own name being called had just told the enemy exactly where he was. The cross was gone from his sleeve. The danger it had once invited was still there. He had simply stopped advertising it. The war ended. The islands went quiet. The men who lived came home and, for the most part, did not talk about the details, the way that generation rarely did. But the lesson they had learned did not disappear. It settled into how the American military thought about protecting its medics from then on. The comforting idea that a symbol alone could keep a healer safe had been tested in the harshest possible conditions, and it had not held. So why did Navy corpsmen stop trusting the Red Cross in the Pacific? Not because they stopped believing in what it stood for. They believed in it more than almost anyone, because they were the ones it was meant to protect. They stopped trusting it because they watched it fail over and over on beach after beach, and because the enemy they faced had already decided that the man under the cross was the most important man on the field to kill. The Red Cross was one of humanity's better ideas, a line drawn through the middle of the worst thing people do to each other, saying even here, even now, some things are off limits. The Pacific War is one of the places where that line was rubbed out. The corpsmen did not erase it out of cruelty. They erased it from their own arms because keeping it there was getting them killed, and the wounded still needed someone to come. What that reveals is not really about one symbol at all. It is about how quickly the rules meant to hold back the horror can dissolve. Once both sides decide the fighting matters more than the rules. On those islands, the emblem of mercy became a mark of death, and the men who understood that first were the ones who had trained their whole lives to save. They took the cross off their sleeves. They never took it out of what they did. If you want to keep going, the story of how the enemy in the Pacific treated prisoners and how that shaped everything from the beaches to the surrender is waiting on screen right now. Watch that one next.